Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Todd and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Todd Hickey. Todd is an ergonomist with WorkSafe NB and as well as a very popular speaker on the Health and Safety Conference circuit. Welcome, Todd.
Hi, Burley. Thanks for having me.
Firstly, why don't you tell folks a little bit about your background and your current responsibilities at WorkSafe?
Sure. I actually started in the field, I guess, going back to my university days, which is a few years further back than I'll admit on a podcast that'll be recorded in perpetuity, but it was a while ago. Proud Dalhousie University alumni. Go Tigers. I finished my degree there and came back to Miramichi in 2000, late end of 2000. I came back as a certified kinesiologist and certified exercise physiologist, so I worked a lot with athletes while I was at university and athlete injuries and preventing injuries that way. And so that kind of got me into the field of being interested in injuries and how they work and how they heal. And I came back to Miramichi. I was lucky enough to have a friend that owned a physiotherapy clinic, Sue Butler. Sue's still around. And I started working with her. And then I actually started in WorkSafe NB in 2005. I was actually accepted, believe it or not. I don't even know if I've ever told you about this, but I was accepted to Atlantic Baptist University to go back to school to become a teacher. I had the thought that I was going to teach elementary school, and then WorkSafe NB called for a job as an ergonomics consultant at the time. It was still technically Workplace Health Safety and Compensation Commission. I didn't really know a lot about the commission at the time, to be honest, but the job sounded really interesting, and then so that's sort of where I started. So I transitioned from treating people who were injured to trying to get out into the field and prevent injuries sort of at the site. And I finished up my Canadian Certified Professional Ergonomist certification. And actually most recently did my certification as a psychological health and safety advisor with the Canadian Mental Health Association, which is sort of my new passion. I'm really intrigued by how that works. It's sort of a combination of introducing the cognitive side of ergonomics, which I'm sure we can chat a little bit about later, with the physical side, which is kind of the part that people tend to know a little bit more about in what we do at WorkSafe NB. So essentially, my role is looking after and working within the premise of what we call musculoskeletal injuries, so MSIs, so kind of soft tissue injuries, ligaments, muscles, nerves, tendons, those types of things, and looking at ways that they can be prevented in any and all industries and types of workplaces across the province.
So I want to leave folks that are listening to the podcast today with some actual information that they can use at their workplace. So three main types of ergonomic concerns that I guess you get asked about a lot. Office ergonomics, number one. Number two, patient lifting in a healthcare environment. And number three, manual material handling. For each of these three topics, if you were given 5 minutes to highlight some of the key issues and concerns that are commonly seen with the work being done in each area, what kind of solutions might you suggest for each of these topics? So the first one we'll deal with is office ergonomics. So you get a call one day from a company has, say, 20 people working in an office and said, look, we don't know too much about our office ergonomics. You've got 5 minutes, sort of give us your scoop.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, there's a lot of overlap within all of these, I guess, the areas that you want to talk about as well. And really, for me, at the end of the day, it always comes down to posture. Pretty much all of these things eventually will revert us down to posture and trying to make sure people are in the best posture that they should be in to do the work that they need to do. And so when we talk about things like an office environment, people working in office ergonomics, we think a lot about people that are going to be sitting in chairs for a long time. And so kind of the quick and dirty analogy I like to use for people when it comes to sort of why sitting is seen as such a problem. If you think about for easy math, let's say I weigh 100 pounds. And when I'm standing up, I'm in my natural human posture. We as human beings are built to be upright and standing. And I've got a nice curve in my lower back, which everybody will have. Some will have a little bit more than others, but everybody has a bit of a curve. That's natural. That's the posture I should be in. That 100 pounds is evenly distributed across both of my legs, the largest muscles in my body, holding me on the planet. Everything is essentially in balance. I put myself into a chair. The very first thing that happens is that nice lower back curve, the lumbar curve that I had, actually flattens out. Can't do anything about that. Puts me into a posture where my lower back is essentially compromised. Then we think about the fact that the arteries, veins, nerves, even musculature in the back of my legs is being compressed because I'm sitting on it. And so, we've got some problems with blood flow. We got problems with nerve conduction, things like that as well. Then we think about, and you can do this yourself, Pearly, when you're sitting in the chair, where is that 100 pounds that you weigh actually being distributed to hold you on the planet? You can lift your feet off the floor right now in your chair and you're not going to fall over. And so all of that 100 pounds of force is essentially being directed directly into your lower back, which is in a compromised position, on top of the fact that all of the other physiological things that we just kind of talked about with nerve conduction and muscles and things like that. And that's why we get into the situation of saying that sitting is such a problem in an office work environment. The good news is all of the bad things that come with sitting are fairly easily rectified with simply standing up on occasion. So what we try to get people to think about is kind of two sets of numbers I would give your listeners on a regular basis, and I promise I won't bombard people with numbers throughout this, but I would say 30 and 1. So think about every 30 minutes, get yourself out of your chair for a minute. Doesn't matter how good your chair is. Doesn't matter that your chair is spectacularly well designed for you and all of those things. On occasion I'll tell people it's great to have a good chair. Sometimes it's problematic to have a great chair. A great chair tends to be incredibly comfortable and you don't want to get out of it. But we actually want you to get out of your chair on occasion. So we'd say every 30 minutes, get yourself out of your chair for a minute. Ideally move around a little bit, but at the very least stand up and give your muscles a chance to get into a different position. The larger muscles, larger joints in your body is essentially what you're going to be moving when you stand up. And the second set of numbers I'll give you has to do with the eyes. So what happens in an office environment, we're staring at a screen for an extended period of time. Most people's screens tend to be somewhere around maybe 30 inches away. Between 20 and 40 tends to be a standard. There's actually a Canadian standard, CSEP-CEP-412. I sit on the technical committee for that, and the normative numbers that we'll give are between 50 and 100 centimeters. So most people tend to be in about that range. Whatever it happens to be for you, what it means is you're staring at a screen that distance away for an extended period of time. And so you get into what we call focal range lock, which is just a fancy way to say that your eyes are stuck seeing something at a particular distance for an extended period of time. And so we want the little muscles in your eyes to get a chance to move around the same way we want the large ones in your body to get a chance to move around. And so what we say there is try every 10 minutes to look at something that's about 10 feet away from you for about 10 seconds. So 10, 10, and 10. What we're really saying is get out of your chair as often as you can and look away from the screen as often as you can to give your body a chance to get into the positions that it wants to be in naturally so that you don't end up stuck in those static postures. Essentially, when everyone got sent to work from home back in the day, however many years ago it was now that this all kind of happened, it seemed like it was going to be a really great thing. A lot of people actually really liked the idea of working from home when it first happened, but I mean, the reality was that not everybody had an enormous mansion that they lived in with an office for themselves and an office for their spouse and an office for each of their kids, all completely separated. Most people tended to be sitting at a desk hunched over in front of their laptop. And so we got into a situation, and in a lot of the presentations that I gave, I'll tell people the number one thing to think about is not to let working at home turn into living at your office. And there's a huge distinction there. Working from home can be great for a lot of people. I mean, all of the bonuses that come along with that, but with that coin flip, we say that you may also be living at your office, meaning that you are at your workplace all the time. You don't get away from it. You don't get the physical and psychological breaks. So again, kind of coming back to the posture idea, it's just make sure that you get yourself moving as often as you can. And that'll get you the physical breaks, but it also gets you the psychological ones too, right? To get up and out of your office space just for a few minutes at a time, or to go for a walk on your lunch break, or take the normal breaks you would take if you were in an office environment, at around 10 o'clock where you'd go and maybe grab a coffee and you and I would chat about the Chiefs' loss last night that I really don't want to talk about too much because it was a little heartbreaking, but those kind of breaks will give you a chance to change those postures in a way that we want you to do that.
Do you still get a lot of requests for ergonomic assessments in the office environment?
We do, and so through WorkSafe NB, we don't do technically one-on-one office ergonomics assessments. We honestly it would be impossible for us to keep up with that, and so there are some private providers out there that do that, but we offer educational sessions where we would essentially go in and I would say, if we were going in to talk to you, Pearly, we would say, let's get your people together in a room. Let's go through a presentation, and we've got a computer workstation guide that we created in December of 2020. And I mean, not to toot our own horn or my own horn, but it's an incredible guide. Available bilingually on our website. We've got lots of other jurisdictions that reach out to us to try to get to use that as well, and we're always happy to share information-wise. But we would kind of sit down or stand up with the people in the room, walk them through the guide, how it works, and then maybe take you to one workstation and say, okay, let's sort of apply the knowledge that we just got in that hour and a half presentation. Let's go through one person's workstation and set them up. And what we have found and what I have found is that, if I do my job well and I teach the people in the room what they should do, the vast majority of people can use that guide to set themselves up the way that they need to. You'll occasionally get some outliers here and there, like some medical outliers that have a particular problem that they need to be dealt with in a specific way, and you would call in a professional for those. But the vast majority of people are able to use that guide as it was designed, really just a step-by-step, here's how you set yourself up, here's your measurements, things like that.
COVID, you mentioned that a moment ago. Was that a concern from the point of view that a whole lot of people were being sent home without really proper setups at home?
It really was, yeah. So there was a lot of people that had a great setup or actually a pretty good setup at the very least in an office environment, and then would go home. And at the time, we were being sent home with a laptop. When it initially happened, people weren't really sure how long this was going to take, right? I can still remember us getting an email saying everybody's going to be working from home for 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks later getting an email saying everyone's going to be working from home for 3 months, then 6 months, and then indefinite. We weren't sure. So initially, it was a thought of how do we sort of, what we used to say was sort of Frankenstein the best possible solution that we would have for people, which was, you only have a laptop right now. What is the best way to do it? And it really at that time just came down to you need to take even more breaks than you normally would. The breaks we talked about earlier, that 30 and 1 and 10, 10 and 10, those are even when you have an ideal setup, you still need to take those breaks. So you can imagine if my setup is not ideal, I would need to take even more breaks to make sure I don't end up in those postures that I shouldn't be in for longer periods of time. So we did see a lot of that, and we've got now some people that are sort of working in hybrid environments, and a lot of employers have done really great work making sure that people are set up properly at home. For those who are working primarily at home, or even those who are in a hybrid environment, we have them set up well at home and set up well in an office space. So we are seeing things get a lot better, but yeah, at the start it was a bit of a free for all.
Yeah, I remember talking to folks and they said, "Oh, well, I'm working from home at my kitchen table," and I'd sort of cringe a bit and say, "Well, yeah, maybe for a week or two that'll be fine, but if COVID certainly drags on, you're going to need to adjust." What do you think of stand-up workstations?
They can be incredibly beneficial. No doubt about that. I guess, a lot of people think that they need to have a sit-stand workstation or what's technically called a height-adjustable workstation, and they can be great in certain environments because they will allow you to work in both a standing posture and a seated posture. Now, we still have to think about the fact that standing still for a long period of time isn't necessarily any better for us than sitting still for a long period of time. What your body is essentially looking for is a change in posture as frequently as possible throughout the day. And so when these desks initially came out, I would see a lot of people that didn't use them at all necessarily, and then some people that maybe didn't quite use them properly, and some people would say, I stand all morning and I sit all afternoon. Well, what you've really done there is put yourself in two static postures for extended periods of time. One isn't necessarily any better than the other. So, if you do have one, the ideal way to actually use them, again, I tend to tell people 30 minutes and 30 minutes, where we'd say stand for 30 minutes and then sit for 30. Alternate like that throughout the day. And include things like sitting for lunch breaks, as maybe you sat down to eat, or maybe you had to drive to work, whatever that may be. Well, you were sitting during that, unless you've got some futuristic stand-up car I don't know about. But think about those things. The true ideal in most of the literature now is actually 45 minutes of standing to 15 minutes of sitting. So we'll get a lot of people that have these desks and want to use them properly, and those are actually the real numbers now. So when you think about, like we mentioned earlier with posture, we should be standing more than we sit, because standing is a natural posture. So 45 minutes upright, 15 minutes of sitting. For those who don't have it, you can get all the same benefits just by getting yourself up and out of your chair every 30 minutes and moving around a little bit. The other thing that I kind of on occasion caution people about with the sit-stand desks is that the thing that I like to think about with the breaks from sitting. So if I said to you now, Pearlie, after 30 minutes, you should be standing up and moving around a little bit. You're also getting kind of that psychological break from work, where you're walking away from your screen, you're walking away from the work that you have to do. But if I push a button, my desk raises up, and I keep on typing that email or writing that report that I was writing, I haven't actually gotten that psychological break. I may be getting the physical side of it because my posture's changed, but psychologically I'm still working sort of full out. And so you have to think about those things as well. That's kind of the side of the field of ergonomics, the cognitive side, the psychological thing we don't always bring to the forefront because it's always been about the physical side for so long. And that was sort of where COVID came into play when we talked about, psychological and psychosocial hazards. It really brought it to the forefront. I mean, the spoiler alert is that they were always there. It just was something that sort of came to the forefront when COVID kind of hit. But they have benefits. They can theoretically have a few drawbacks, but again, it's all about posture and making sure that you're getting those postural shifts on a regular basis and not getting stuck in any one particular posture for a long time.
If you have one of those workstations, should you use anti-fatigue mats or not?
I always tell people that if you've got a comfortable pair of shoes, sneakers, things like that, you've got a great pair of anti-fatigue mats that follow you everywhere you go. The problem that I tend to have on occasion with an anti-fatigue mat is I can't put my chair on it, which means that when I'm standing up, I have to be standing on that mat. I have to put my chair somewhere in my office, and let's be honest, a lot of people don't have a space to move around like that. And then when I go to sit down again, I now have to slide that mat out of the way somewhere, maybe just under my desk, and then I have to bring my chair in. And then when I go to stand again, I have to move my chair out of the way, I have to go underneath my desk, get that mat, and slide it out. And eventually, for a lot of people, it just becomes a bit of a hassle, and they don't want to do it. What I will say is, in place of having something like an anti-fatigue mat, what you do need to have if you work standing up is actually a footrest. So a standard kind of footrest you would see, and initially footrests were designed for people whose desks were too high, and we would raise their chair up so that we could align them properly, and their feet sometimes didn't touch the floor, and so, we would give them a footrest underneath. It's not an ideal situation when you're sitting down, but it is an absolute necessity when you're standing up. And so you're looking for essentially taking that footrest, lining your toes up with footrest, putting one foot on it while you're standing, and then every minute or so, whatever it happens to be, again, I tend to tell people if you start to feel slightly fidgety while you're standing, that's your body telling you it wants you to change postures. And so that may be, for me, it might be every 45 seconds. For you, Pearlie, it could be every 2 minutes. Totally fine. Just shift your feet. One foot goes up, one foot goes down, back and forth. And the kind of the analogy or the joke that I drop a lot with these is, the old English pubs had this stuff figured out lifetime before the rest of us did. When you see those pictures of the old English pubs, there was always this brass foot rail in front of the bar. The reason before that was you put a foot there, you'd stand there for longer, and you'd spend a little bit more money. So they had it figured out before the rest of us did, but we're there now as well. And you'll see it a lot in other environments, in retail, in checkouts, things like that. You go to the grocery store and you'll see that they'll have generally a combination of an anti-fatigue mat and a footrest bar for the people that are standing there working for a long period of time. But again, with the mats, I just find that they can kind of get more in the way. And if you've got a good pair of shoes, they'll do almost the same thing for you as the mat would do anyway.
So much we could talk about. Also, in regards to office ergonomics, moving ahead to a client that perhaps you work with, one you went into, could you talk a little bit about, just to give folks an example of the benefits of doing an assessment or the benefits of working with a company as an ergonomist? Can you think back to an example of a company you worked with when you went in? What did you see? What did you recommend? And what was the outcome?
Absolutely, yeah. So we've done, over the years, we've done a lot of these things. Even before we had our fancy new guide, we had an older guide back in the day, and we would go in, and again, initially it would be getting into a boardroom, going through the conversation with people and really breaking it down. And for any of your listeners that want to reach out, of course, about any of this, reach out to me. We'll get you the contact information, all those fun things. But we have the presentation available. We also have I kind of created, I'm going to call it a cheat sheet. Although in today's world, I guess it's a cheat slide. It's essentially one slide that sort of walks you through all the easy ways to make sure that you have things lined up. And realistically, we would go in and do a group session like this, bring people into one of those cubicles essentially for most people, and we would say, let's see, and I would kind of stand back and go, I want you as a group to try to set this person up. And so what we found was people learned to ask the right questions once they got these things. Because sometimes, you don't know what you don't know. And when you know better, you can do better. And so just tiny little tweaks of remembering that, we want your thighs to be parallel to the floor. So I would easily just start with people and go, put your knees at 90 degrees, put your elbows at 90 degrees, make sure that the surface your keyboard and your mouse are on are level with that as well. Take the top of your monitor, the screen, if you will, and have it lined up with your eyes, unless you're wearing bifocal lenses, in which case it needs to be a little bit lower. And then the distance, again, somewhere between 50 and 100 centimeters. I usually will tell people to start at 75. And then if you're seeing things well and not needing to squint and lean forward, great. And what I found, one of the more recent ones that I did, wasn't necessarily at the time that we had done it. Everything seemed to go really well at the time, but about a week later, I got a call from one of the managers saying, Todd, I just wanted to let you know, one of my staff members came by and sort of barked at me because I was squinting and leaning forward, and I had done that forever and no one said a word. So that was something that came up from the presentation that people start to notice, right? And that's what you want to see. I mean, we should all be taking care of ourselves and the people around us as well. And so that was a big one. That head forward posture, we call it when we're talking about office ergonomics, is very common. And that was one that sort of was flagged after we gave that session.
What other kind of feedback have you received from companies after you've gone in and worked with them?
Always, very lucky, knock on wood, has generally been very good. Whether we're looking at things like doing educational sessions on office ergonomics or working in the manual handling field, with people who are on production lines, things like that. The idea with what we try to do and what I really try to do with WorkSafe is it's all about education first, right? And I know, Pearlie, you worked here for a long time as well, and I was lucky enough to get to work with you for a while, and I still remember meetings that we had in St. John and you and it was Andy Roska at the time, were some other people saying, listen, it's about education first. Let's help people learn the things they need to do to be safe, and let's think about the act and the regulations and writing orders somewhere further down the line. It should always be about education first. And so when you go in with that mindset to work with an employer to help them to make their employees safe and healthy at work, I have found that it's leaps and bounds above anything else. And so I've gotten great feedback, both from going into work with employers and going to do sessions. I know I've seen you on the health and safety conference circuit quite regularly. And it's a great way to sort of get the information out to a lot of people. And with those, I say the same. It's always about, there's a limited amount of time for these presentations, but what I want to sort of leave people with is enough information that it piques their curiosity, and they maybe start to ask those questions either to myself or to somebody else, because you never know who's going to be in a room in those larger sessions. And so you want to make sure you're giving enough information of a couple of different topics. And so going into work with employers, always try to do the same thing, right? You never know who you're going to have. I may have managers in the same room as I have frontline workers, as I have executives. And so, sometimes they want different pieces of information. So we want to make sure we include little bits of all of those things, so that, we don't lose a few people in the room. And you don't want to have anyone nodding off. And so, yeah, we found that it's worked really well. I mean, again, this has been, jeepers, I'm coming up on, 19 years. I'm aging myself a little bit here, with the organization. So I've learned a few tricks along the way, but, there's a younger generation coming in behind me, so we'll be fine going forward.
Talk to us a little bit about manual material handling.
Yeah, so manual handling, again, it sort of always comes back to posture when we think about it. We always talk about sort of the primary risk factors. So we talk about, I put them in the order that I truly believe that they should be in, which is awkward postures, forceful exertions, repetition, and then what we call sustained static exertions. And so for me, awkward postures, when you think about manual handling, the way that I try to really explain to people awkward postures is pretty easy. You think about, everyone's gone to the grocery store, and gotten to the house and had a few bags of groceries in each hand, and then walked into the house and tried to place those bags of groceries up onto the counter and thought, geez, suddenly I can't do that, right? It's like if I said to you, Pearlie, you've got a box behind you on a shelf there, grab that box and hold it for me close to your chest with two hands, and then take that same box in two hands and hold it directly out in front of you at full arm's length. You go, well, the box feels really heavy. I go, here's the thing. The box is not any heavier as you hold it further away from you. Posturally, it has become more difficult for you because the posture in which you're holding that box has become more awkward. If I take a 20-pound box on a shelf that's about the height of your waist, and I say, Pearlie, could you pick this up for me, carry it across the room, and put it on that other shelf that's at waist height, not really an issue. If I say, Pearlie, can you get that 20-pound box that's underneath my desk behind the other box, pick it up, carry it across the room, and put it on that shelf that's 7 feet up in the air, suddenly it feels a lot heavier. The box still weighs 20 pounds. It has nothing to do with the weight of the box. It has everything to do with posture. In an office environment, we would get people to do this, and if your listeners want to try this as well, we would get people to essentially just keep your wrist in what we call a neutral posture, which is your hand just straight out in front of you as it would normally be, palm facing down, and you would take your opposite hand, put two fingers in, and essentially squeeze your fingers as hard as you can squeeze them, and you'll have 100% of whatever your strength happens to be. Yours might be a lot more than mine. It doesn't matter. It's 100% of your strength. Then if you take and put your wrist into what we call an awkward posture, which is essentially bend your wrist either direction, either what we call extension, so the back of your hand towards your forearm, or flexion with your palm towards your forearm, so you're essentially bending it straight down. Do the same thing, put 2 fingers in there and squeeze as hard as you can, and you'll see how much weaker you are in those particular postures. You should theoretically still have the same amount of strength, but you don't, because the posture at your wrist has made you weaker. So when it comes to manual handling, step 1, phase 1 for me is always saying, what kind of postures do your people have to work in, and how close are they to what we would call the ideal posture, which is getting to keep those items that are heavy close to what we call your power zones, so around waist height, things like that. The way that you would naturally lift something if you had to lift something, right? Which is keeping it close to your body, keeping it at about waist height. How far away are you, and how do we get you closer to that? That usually tends to be the first one. On occasion, we'll see things when we talk about forceful exertions where the weight of a particular object is just way outside the scope of what a human being can actually lift, and then we say, okay, well, we also need to look at that. But generally speaking, what I have seen is it tends to be the postures people have to get in, and once we can fix those, get them closer to the ideal, then the amount of weight doesn't always factor in. It does on occasion. But certainly with things like the repetition, I mean, if you have to lift something in an awkward posture that's incredibly heavy, the more times you have to do it, the worse it is. But if it's an ideal posture and a relatively normalized weight, most people can do that on a pretty regular basis. And then the sustained static exertion tends to come up more often kind of in an office environment. Again, it's a primary risk factor, but essentially when we talk about blood flow and the way the sustained static exertion works. If you think about right now, you're sitting in your chair and you're not really doing anything. We're having a conversation and we're just sitting here. The muscles in your body always still need some nutrients, and you need to get some oxygen flowing, and you've got your resting heart rate happening. And everything tends to be in balance, right? You're not really doing any work necessarily, and so they're not creating a high demand for that oxygen, for those nutrients. And whatever your resting heart rate is tends to keep you in balance. You need a certain amount of blood flowing. You've got that amount of blood flowing. Then if I said, hey, Pearlie, let's end your podcast now and let's go for a run for some wild reason, and we decide we're going to go out and go for a run, well, now we're doing more physical activity. When we do more physical activity, what happens to our heart rate? Our heart rate speeds up. It moves faster. The reason is our muscles are crying for more oxygen, more nutrients, but they're getting it because our heart rate is sped up. Now, when we look at somebody who's sitting in a chair doing some work, and we're essentially saying, we're going to do a little bit of typing, so the muscles in my fingers are going to be moving. We're working with our mouse, and so the forearm and the wrist and the musculature around there are moving as well. So those muscles are saying, could you get me some more nutrients? Could you get me some more oxygen, things like that? But you're not actually doing movement in the traditional sense. And so your heart rate still stays at that basic resting heart rate. So now you've got these muscles that are saying, give me more oxygen, give me more nutrients, and your heart saying, not going to do it. I'm at your resting heart rate, and you get that imbalance. On top of, like we said earlier, if you're sitting in a chair, you're actually compressing a lot of the arteries and nerves in the back of your legs. So those sustained static exertions can come up as problematic, both in a sitting posture and in a standing. Again, for people who are standing on a production line and not getting to physically move a lot, the same thing can happen because you're moving your arms and things like that, but you're not necessarily getting your heart rate up that tiny bit to get that blood flowing the way that the muscles want it to flow. Again, though, for me, awkward posture tends to be the one. If you think about kind of controlling for that, most of the other ones tend to kind of fall in line in behind it. There's some secondary risk factors in there as well. I mean, we talk about people who have had previous injuries, maybe being more likely to get an injury later, and as we get a little bit older, maybe more likely to get injured, things like that. But really for me, like with everything else, with the office, with the manual handling, it tends to come back to that posture.
So the age-old question, how much should an employee lift?
Always the magic question, right? And yeah. the magic answer is there is no real number. So at WorkSafe New Brunswick, and generally speaking, I mean across most of the globe, the ISO standard exists, which 11228 again is available. And if people are looking for some info on that, again, we'll get the contact info. You can reach out to me because that would be a 3-hour-long podcast in and of itself just to talk about that. But essentially, it looks at lifting in what we call the ideal posture. So kind of what we talked about, getting to keep that box, whatever that thing happens to be. We say box all the time, whatever the material is you happen to be lifting, as close to your body as you can in an ideal position with a good grip in comfortable environmental conditions as well. And we know we live in Atlantic Canada, and that's not always a reality here. But we would say there, and what the science has said, and they divide this by biological males, biological females, and what the science has told us over the years is that biological males tend to be physically stronger than biological females on average. And I always, when I'm doing these presentations, will tell the people in the room that I have a pretty clear example for why that's on average and not always the truth. But within that ISO standard, again, not regulated anywhere at all, but it's sort of used for the red flags of if you're above this or below this. It's 25 kilograms for males and 15 kilograms for females. So we're essentially saying if you've got a group of all male employees and you've got things that have to regularly be lifted that are above 25 kilograms, you might want to take a look at that and try to figure out what you can do. If you've got all female employees and it's above 15 kilograms, the same would apply. You might want to take a look. If you have a mix of employees, anything above 15 still becomes your red flag because we're always looking to make sure that everybody is accommodated in these things. And so those are kind of the numbers that tend to exist. Again, ISO standard, internationally recognized, not regulated, certainly not within the province of New Brunswick, but for us is sort of the red flag that we use for do we need to look at this? Should we be looking at this? Should we be having someone take a look at this?
So that leads to my next question.
Yeah.
Regulations.
Yep.
There are no regulations here in New Brunswick on ergonomics. Should there be?
Well, I'll say this, Pearlie. I would never want to tell you, having known you for as long as I have and worked with you, that you're wrong on that one. But this might be one time where I would say to people, technically there are regulations around ergonomics in New Brunswick, and there are across the country. We just don't always look at them that way. Even things like when we look at under the Act, 9-1 under the Act, which says that, duties of employers shall take every reasonable precaution to ensure the health and safety of the employees. Yeah. Well, that includes things like ergonomics and MSI hazards, right? So it is within there. We also have basics of Section 16 in the Act, which talks about storage. So you have to make sure that things are stored in a way that they don't create a hazard. So going back to the example of getting you to pick up that box that's underneath a desk and weighs 20 pounds, well, why am I storing those underneath the desk? Because that's creating a hazard for you having to go under and get them. And then in the regulations, we have 52, which is talking about when you're handling an object or material, the employer needs to provide adequate and appropriate equipment, and then need to make sure that you've been trained on it and that they're using the equipment. And so those are in there as well. So
do we need more detail though? You're correct in what you say, but some people would say, well, look, do we need more detail on that? Relative
I would say
it's and so on.
Yeah, it's difficult, I would say, and there are some other jurisdictions that have tried that, but I can tell you that our numbers as far as MSI and the numbers that we look at, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier on, but we're at about we're actually about 36%. Actually, 2023, we're trending down a little bit, 34.91% as of yesterday of the injuries that we see are MSIs, and that is the lowest in the country. And last year we were at 37.25%. Again, the lowest in the country. And I always temper this with the fact that we know when COVID hit, stats for almost everything across the globe, whatever you were looking at, were skewed dramatically. But when we looked at stats, there was actually a great presentation given quite recently on the stats from 2000 to 2019. And it was on MSI injuries, and they looked at kind of two different sets of numbers. They looked at back injuries, which tend to be the one that we see more often, and shoulders. And New Brunswick, I will say, a pat on all of our backs, if you'll pardon the pun, led the country by a fairly significant amount. We were lower than every other province in the country by a fairly significant amount, even when the numbers were normalized for 100,000 FTEs. And so when we take the number of claims per 100,000 FTEs, New Brunswick was by far the best in the country for that. So not having more specific regulations hasn't necessarily hurt us, and having more specific regulations in other provinces hasn't necessarily led them to using them more often either. I just always am hesitant to say the amount of time it takes to create more regulations, and again, I'm preaching to the choir, and this one probably you would know, can take us forever. But what about finding the regulations that we already have and just using them in a different way and saying to people, well, under 9-1, you have to take every reasonable precaution to ensure the health and safety of your employees. And you're having Pearlie lift a box that weighs 100 pounds that's under a desk and carry it across a room and put it on a shelf above his head. That's not reasonable. So I don't need another regulation for that necessarily. Do they need to be more specific? I would have a hard time saying for sure. I will tell you it's on our radar to take a look at regulations around MSI starting next year and what kind of changes we want to recommend to it. The specificity for that and putting in a number, right? That's what people always want to see and want to hear. Put a number on the maximum amount of weight that people can lift. And I can tell you it's a virtual scientific and mathematical impossibility to do specifically that. But we can get better at using what we have and educating people to know that, again, those numbers are ISO numbers, not regulated, but if it's above 25 kilograms, that's a red flag. You should be taking a look at why your people have to lift stuff that weighs more than 25 kilograms that frequently, or 15 kilograms on the other side of things when we're looking at the female population.
Are there any provinces that have ergonomic regulations, specific ergonomic regulations?
There are a few other jurisdictions that have some more specific regulations than what we have, and we tend to kind of lean towards BC has a few other things out there as well that are, and these are all available. And again, I mean, not working in those provinces. I mean, I wouldn't want to purport myself to be the expert on their regulations, but they do have a few available on their sites as well. Newfoundland has a couple as well that are a little bit more specific, but most tend to sort of bounce around where we are with our regulation, and specifically 52. When we look at that, where the health or safety of an employee handling the object material may be endangered, you have to provide them with equipment, make sure they use it, and train them on how to use it properly. So there's variations on that across the globe, certainly across Canada, and some that are slightly more specific, but not so much more specific that we can't use what we have in just a slightly different way than we have previously.
Couple of quick questions to finish up, and certainly there's so much we could talk about. You've been in the business now quite a number of years. We won't say.
Thank you for that.
It's been a long time I've known you. What changes have you seen in ergonomics since you get into the field at university?
Wow, I have seen, strangely, when I started at university, there were only 1 or 2 courses in ergonomics, and they were strictly physical based. And we're now seeing a lot of work being done on the cognitive side, and a lot of work being done in fatigue. And that's my new passion. I am fascinated by it all. And it leads into kind of the psychological and the psychosocial hazards that really factor in there as well. So essentially, I guess kind of as I'd mentioned, we look at sort of the physical hazards and we look at the cognitive hazards, or the psychological, the psychosocial, whichever terminology you prefer, when it comes to ergonomics. And we have an expertise in both, and we can look at both. We haven't always done that. And with COVID and with everything that hit, the psychological, psychosocial really came to the forefront. And so, I mean, it was a great way to be able to get out and say, listen, these things are happening, and we can help with what is happening. You know, reach out to us. These are services that we can help you with. Through WorkSafe, we can get out and we can take a look at the work that you're doing. We can look at it on the physical side. We can look at it on the cognitive side. And as far as the changes, and more recently, I mean, like everything else, sort of technology has really come to the forefront. I mean, AI, video capture, things like that. When we used to go out with, you know, I remember starting with the old VHS camcorders and going out and recording video, and then going back and counting postures on a piece of paper in little tick boxes. We now have AI and video capture technology that can do that. We have people that can have wearable technology so that, you know, in real time you can get even things like vibration that will remind you that you're bent further than you should, or you're leaning further than you should, because of the wearables that you happen to have on. And now the wearables are getting further adapted to where they're actually just within the shirt that you might wear. Now, have on occasion, I'm a little bit leery with that. You know, I heard a great quote a long time ago, and I always wish that I could remember who said it, and I can't. So if any of your listeners know, please reach out and let me know. But it was essentially the thought that every piece of technology out there is just a bridge to the next piece of technology. So it's an exciting concept on occasion, but I'm also a little leery going, well, how far down this road can we go, right? And you think about, like, I would always joke about, you know, we went from 8 tracks to cassettes to CDs to MP3s, right? Everything that happens, we went from landline phones to giant bag phones that you would carry around in your vehicle to regular size cell phones to smartphones and tablets. I mean, everything bridges to the next. And so now we're at the point with health and safety and ergonomics in general where we're saying we have AI, we have video capture, we have all of these things. I don't exactly know what the next step would be, but I think it's an interesting time. You know, we're looking at things like Industry 5.0, and so Industry 4.0 was all about essentially kind of the Internet of Things and big data and using data and collecting data. And now it's what do we do with that data? So 5.0 is essentially looking at people working alongside machines in ways that they did not, and actually bringing to the forefront more of the human aspect of work. So more of how can people be psychologically safe at work, and how can they be physically safe? And again, in some of the presentations I've given, I like to always go to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. and looking at kind of side by side, I guess, if you will, with the idea of, and I mean, again, preaching to the choir, you've worked in health and safety for even longer than I have. So the controls idea, right? You've got elimination, substitution, engineering, all the way down to PPE, right? Then you've got this hierarchy of needs, which is the pyramid seen in the other direction. And when you put the two of them side by side, you get this great visual of the idea that people want to be safe, but they also want to feel safe. And it's not always the same thing. And so how do we use the technology that's available to us to bridge the gap between people just being safe at work, but also feeling safe at work? How do we keep the human in human factors and ergonomics? Really, really interesting where it's going to go. I'm not a great bettor. If the results of my football pool lately will tell you anything, I'm terrible. So whatever I bet on would probably be wrong anyway. But I really do, I do think that this idea of Industry 5.0 and looking to add kind of the human, the environmental, the social aspects of work into it is an exciting part of the new field. I mean, at the end of the day, if we want healthy people, we have to have healthy work. And that's what it comes down to. And the idea of, we can't always make things completely safe, but we can almost always make things safer. And so how do we do that on both the physical and the psychological side is what really keeps me driven and keeps me still really excited about the field in general and where it has been going. Maybe I'll be talking to you again in 19 more years, or I'll be in your chair in 19 years. Maybe you'll finally get to retire.
Well, look, we certainly want to bring you back in the new year to talk. Very intrigued by psychological safety and that fit in the future, hearing more and more about it all the time, getting asked more and more questions all the time as well. So we certainly want to bring you back in the new year to talk about that. We really didn't get a chance either to talk about patient lifting in a healthcare environment. Again, we'll perhaps get you back to talk about that topic as well. That's certainly a very popular one as well. Thank you very much, Todd, for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. A very critical topic for, I think, pretty much every industry out there. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. We look forward to future podcasts with Todd and a number of other professionals in health and safety around the province. Thank you very much. See you next week.
Great. Thanks for having me, Pearlie.